Welcome to the Rational Edge.
Hello?
Usually when we look at major corporate events, the kind that reshape industries and just dominate the news, the conversation tends to focus on all the noise.
Right. The market reaction, the headlines, the public sentiment.
But today, we're going to strip all of that away. We're going to examine one of the most significant events in automotive history, strictly through the lens of financial reporting.
It's a refreshing approach. We're really looking at the gray zone of corporate finance.
The gray zone.
Yeah, that specific territory where, engineering data meets accounting standards.
And the tool we're using to navigate this territory is an accounting standard called IAS 37. It stands for provisions, contingent liabilities, and contingent assets.
I know it sounds incredibly dry.
It does sound like the title of a very dry textbook, but as we're going to see, this standard is actually a mechanism for truth-telling.
It is. IAS 37 is the framework that forces a company to translate real-world risks into actual numbers on a balance sheet.
And the case study we're applying this to is the Volkswagen Group, specifically looking at the timeline from 2014 to 2024 regarding the diesel issue.
Right.
Our mission today is to analyze how a technical reporting failure, a delay in recognizing a liability, how that spiraled into a global crisis.
And we're going to do this without using emotional language. We aren't here to judge motives.
No, we're here to judge the application of accounting principles.
Exactly. We want to understand the mechanics of the decision-making process.
Yeah.
How does a company move from knowing about a technical discrepancy to, recognizing a multi-billion euro loss?
So let's start with the ground rules. If I'm running a multinational corporation and I become aware of a risk, maybe a lawsuit is brewing or a product has a defect, at what point does that risk become a debt?
That's the fundamental question.
At what point does IAS 37 tell me you need to tell your investors about this?
So IAS 37 categorizes these future obligations into 3 distinct levels. It's all based on probability.
Probability.
Basically, how likely is it that cash will have to leave the company because of this event?
Okay, let's walk through the 3 levels. What's the first one?
The first and most serious level is a provision.
A provision.
Under the standard, you must recognize a provision. So you book the debt on your balance sheet right away if 2 conditions are met. First, the outflow of resources must be probable.
More likely than not.
Correct. And second, you have to be able to reliably estimate the amount.
Okay, so probable and estimable. If you meet those, you book it.
You book it. Now, what if the outflow is, say, possible, but not quite probable? Or maybe it's probable, but you just can't put a reliable number on it yet.
Right.
That moves you to the second level, a contingent liability.
And how do you handle that?
You don't record it on the balance sheet itself, but you are required to disclose it in the notes of your financial statements. You have to tell stakeholders the risk exists.
Even if you can't quantify it.
Exactly.
And the third level?
The third level is remote. If the probability of an outflow is remote, no recognition or disclosure is required. You can keep that information internal.
So we have a clear hierarchy. Provision means you book the cost. Contingent liability, you disclose the risk. Remote means you say nothing.
That is the framework management has to work with.
Okay. Keeping that framework in mind, let's travel back to 2014. At this point, Volkswagen is operating under Strategy 2018. The goal was pretty clear: volume and global expansion.
Right.
And in the annual reports from this period, the company's position regarding U.S. emissions regulations was that any risk of non-compliance was remote.
Remote. There were no provisions booked, no contingent liabilities disclosed in the notes. From an external reporting perspective, the risk effectively did not exist.
However, internal documentation seems to provide a different data set.
It does.
We need to examine a specific document cited in the SEC complaint. It's known as the Winterkorn Memo, dated May 23, 2014.
This document is very significant for our timeline. Martin Winterkorn was the CEO at the time. The memo informed him of a study by the ICCT, the International Council on Clean Transportation.
And this study was different because they weren't testing in a lab.
Exactly. They'd conducted tests on the road. And the data they gathered showed a significant discrepancy.
What did the memo say?
The memo noted that during these road tests, nitrogen oxide emissions were to 35 times the permissible legal limit.
35 times, not 35%. 35 times.
Yes.
From an IAS 37 perspective, receiving a memo like that has to trigger a reassessment of probability.
It has to. If you're management and you get data showing your product exceeds regulatory limits by a factor of 35, the classification of that risk should theoretically shift?
You have to ask, is a fine or recall now probable?
Is it still remote?
The SEC complaint then details the internal response. Instead of a disclosure, there was a series of meetings with high-level executives. The sources named Bernd Gottweiss, who handled product safety, and Heinz-Jacob Neusser, a development chief.
And this is where the actions taken become really relevant to the accounting treatment. The source material states that during these meetings, executives allegedly instructed engineers to destroy documents.
And something else specific.
And specifically, to ditch their cell phones.
Ditch your cell phones. That is a very specific administrative instruction.
It is. And if we analyze that instruction strictly through the lens of IAS 37, it serves as a kind of probability indicator.
How so?
In corporate governance, you generally preserve documentation to demonstrate compliance. If you believe this is just a minor technical error, a measurement glitch,
you keep the data to prove your case?
You keep everything. Precisely. However, telling staff to remove documentation suggests that management saw that information as damaging. It implies an internal acknowledgement that if the regulator knew the facts, a negative outcome wasn't just possible.
It was probable.
It was probable. So, analytically speaking, the effort to manage the information flow almost confirms that the liability existed.
They were treating the risk as probable operationally.
By managing the evidence.
While still treating it as remote financially in their reporting.
That's the disconnect. By keeping it in the remote bucket, the balance sheet stayed clean. But the underlying obligation, the debt to regulators and customers, was already accumulating.
I want to dig deeper into the nature of that obligation. Because under accounting rules, there's a difference between a random part failure and something systemic.
Absolutely.
This brings us to the technical mechanism described in court documents, the steering wheel angle recognition.
This technical detail is so crucial because it establishes the intentionality of the design. It determines if the cost is a warranty expense, which is variable, or a regulatory liability, which is often structural and much larger.
Can you explain how this feature actually worked?
Certainly. The software in the engine control unit monitored several inputs, but the key one was the steering wheel.
Okay.
When a vehicle is undergoing standard emissions testing, it's on a dynamometer.
Which is basically a treadmill for the car.
It is. The wheels are turning at highway speeds, but the car isn't moving. So the steering wheel angle is 0, and it doesn't change.
So the software detects this state. High wheel speed, 0 steering movement.
Yes. And when it detected that specific state, the system switched to Mode 1.
Mode 1.
This mode optimized the emissions control system to maximize the reduction of nitrogen oxides, making sure the vehicle was compliant during the test.
And what happened if the steering wheel moved?
If the steering wheel angle changed, the software knew the car was being driven on a real road. It then switched to Mode 2.
And in Mode 2?
In that mode, the system reduced the effectiveness of the emissions controls. This was likely to improve other performance metrics, but it meant disregarding the strict non-ox limits.
So from a reporting standpoint, this mechanism removes any possibility of, accidental non-compliance.
It does. You don't accidentally code a system to switch modes based on steering angle. Because the mechanism was designed to alter performance based on the testing environment, the non-compliance was literally built into the product. Under IAS 37, this creates what we call a constructive obligation.
A constructive obligation.
The moment the vehicle sold with that software, the company has an obligation to fix it. The outflow of resources is inherent in the sale.
So effectively, they were selling a liability with every single car.
A liability that remained off the books.
Until September 18th, 2015. That's the date the EPA issued the notice of violation.
That's the trigger. That's the date the timeline shifts. The external regulators validated the data that had been circulating internally since that winter corn memo.
And the financial impact was immediate. If we look at the 2015 annual report, the shift from remote to provision is, it's drastic.
It's historic. In the 2015 reporting period, the company recognized provisions totaling $16.2 billion.
Let's just pause on that number, 16.2 billion euros.
In a single year.
That is a massive sum to charge against your operating result.
It completely wiped out the profit for that period. And this illustrates the mechanics of IAS 37 perfectly. Once the notice of violation was public, the outflow was undeniably probable.
And they could finally reliably estimate the costs.
Exactly.
What made up that 16.2 billion?
It was a combination of technical modifications to the vehicles, the cost of repurchasing cars from customers, And, of course, the anticipated legal risks and fines.
It was the accumulated cost of that gray zone arriving all at once.
All at once.
The 2015 report also had a letter to shareholders from the CEO at the time, Matthias Miller. He wrote explicitly that trust was broken.
That's a significant disclosure. In financial reporting, a statement like that acknowledges that the asset of reputation has been impaired. It signals that the company understood this wasn't just a financial transaction.
It was a fundamental operational crisis.
Yes, and a crisis that necessitated a complete strategic overhaul.
You can actually trace the impact of this accounting event right through the company's long-term strategy documents.
It forced a total pivot. Before 2015, the guiding document was Strategy 2018.
And the primary focus of Strategy 2018 was volume.
All about volume.
It was about becoming the largest automaker in the world by unit sales. Simple as that.
It was a volume-centric model. But after recognizing a $16.2 billion provision, that model was just no longer viable.
The financial constraints, the regulatory scrutiny.
It required a new direction. This led to Together Strategy 2025.
And the language in Strategy 2025 is notably different. It focuses on things like integrity, legal affairs, and a huge shift toward e-mobility.
The inclusion of integrity and legal affairs as a strategic pillar is a direct response to the governance failure, the non-disclosure, the document issue.
They had to institutionalize compliance.
They did, but the shift to e-mobility is maybe the most profound consequence.
Why do you say that?
Because the diesel technology, which had been a core part of their previous strategy, was now legally and financially compromised. To ensure future viability, they had to accelerate their transition to electric drive systems.
So the provision effectively killed the diesel strategy.
And birthed the electric one.
This evolution continued. In 2021, they introduced the new auto strategy with the tagline, Mobility for Generations. And this brings us to the modern challenge. The shift from being a hardware company to a software-driven company.
This is the current frontier. The diesel issue highlighted a critical vulnerability. The company didn't have sufficient control or oversight of its own software integration. The engine control unit was the source of the liability.
To address this, they created a new unit called Cariad.
Yes, Cariad was set up to centralize all software development. The logic is sound. If you control the software stack, you can ensure compliance, you can control the data.
The transition has been difficult.
Very difficult. The 2024 source material indicates Cariad has faced significant challenges, including heavy financial losses.
It sounds like a form of catch-up investment.
That is a very fair assessment. For a long period, engineering resources were directed toward, optimizing that mood-switching logic we discussed. Had those resources been applied to developing a robust, compliant software architecture earlier, the company might be in a very different position today. Now they're investing billions to build that capability.
While also managing the legacy of the diesel issue.
Which has a very long tail. I mean, we're talking about a timeline that stretches a full decade.
Which brings us to the conclusion of the specific legal battles in the United States.
Yes. While the strategic work is ongoing, the SEC litigation reached a formal conclusion very recently. The source material includes the final judgment. It was entered on April 3, 2024.
And it's interesting to see how a global crisis just concludes in paperwork. The judgment notes that Volkswagen Group of America Finance satisfied the judgment.
It's a bureaucratic ending. The document details the payment instructions. It lists the Enterprise Services Center in Oklahoma City as the recipient.
Specifically, the accounts receivable branch on South MacArthur Boulevard.
It's strictly transactional, a wire transfer to Oklahoma City. This marks the formal resolution of the SEC case regarding the bond issuances.
And the allegation there was that by selling bonds in 2014 and 2015 without disclosing the emissions data, the company had provided misleading information to investors.
And this settlement resolves that specific claim. It represents the final closing of the ledger for that specific chapter.
It's quite a journey. From internal memos in 2014 to massive provisions in 2015, the strategic pivot, and then finally,
a wire transfer in 2024. It's a comprehensive case study in how information flows or doesn't flow through a corporation.
It brings us right back to IAS 37.
It does. The standard is designed to align internal knowledge with external reporting.
And in this case, there was a clear disconnect. The internal data, the probable nature of the risk, was just not reflected in the external financial statements.
Not until the regulator forced the issue. And that disconnect is the rational edge we talked about at the start.
The decision to classify a risk as remote rather than probable, it's not just a bookkeeping entry.
No, it's a strategic decision with immense weight.
Because when that gap between remote and probable closes, it usually closes very, very quickly and very expensively.
Precisely. The $16.2 billion charge illustrates the cost of that correction. It's a reminder that these accounting standards are ultimately about accurate risk assessment. If that assessment is flawed, the financial statements just can't reflect the true condition of the company.
It's basically a stress test for corporate governance. The question is always, is the bad news traveling fast enough to the people who have to sign the balance sheet?
And are those people willing to recognize the obligation when the criteria are met, rather than waiting for that notice of violation?
That is the challenge. We live in an era where products are increasingly defined by code, by proprietary algorithms. That steering wheel angle logic was hidden deep within millions of lines of code.
Which implies that the next major contingent liability might currently be sitting on a server somewhere, classified as remote because no one has audited the algorithm yet.
It suggests that investors and analysts really need to think about software compliance as a financial risk, not just some technical detail.
Absolutely. The due diligence has to go deeper than the reported numbers. It has to understand the operational reality behind the technology.
Thank you for listening. See you next time.